And I think what it tells you is equity and change doesn't happen by chance. It needs to be enabled.
You're listening to Let's Imagine, an Imagine Canada podcast for everyone interested in social issues and the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Bruce McDonald. At Imagine Canada, we believe that by leveraging our national vantage point, building cross-sector relationships, and sharing and developing our knowledge base, we can advance social, economic, and environmental justice through our collective action. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that have big implications for the nonprofit and charitable sector here in Canada. A special thank you to our knowledge partner, Carter's Professional Corporation, and our supporting partner, Sage Canada. Together, let's imagine a stronger future. Today, we're going to have the opportunity to talk about the implications from the findings of a new research survey, the Equity Benchmarking Study. This study is part of a research and knowledge mobilization project intended to improve the understanding of what Canadian charities and nonprofits are doing to advance justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. This project is made possible thanks to generous support from our lead partner, Scotiabank. We're also grateful for the support and participation of our senior partner, the Canadian Red Cross. We'd also like to acknowledge the support of our knowledge partner, KCI. This project is led by the Equitable Recovery Collective, a group formed in September of 2020. The collective originally had the mandate of ensuring that equity issues would be integrated into the federal government's ongoing responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Equitable Recovery Collective comprises 15 organizations, including Disability Without Poverty, the Canadian Women's Foundation, Egal Canada, the Muslim Association of Canada, the Network for Advancement of Black Communities, the Ontario Nonprofit Network, and the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada, to name but a few. The Equitable Recovery Collective was inspired by Senator Ratna Amedvar, who championed efforts to generate more data about equity and inclusion at a board governance level. We're pleased that Amanuel, Executive Director of the Network for the Advancement of Black Communities and a member of the collective, is here today to discuss the findings of the Equity Benchmarking Study. Amanuel, welcome. It's so good to have you on the podcast.
Bruce, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Well, before diving into the findings from the Equity Benchmarking Study, let's start at a broader level. There's been a seismic shift in focus and attention on issues of inclusion and equity since the 2020 murder of George Floyd and other Black individuals. Protests in the United States and around the world galvanized public opinion and shone a spotlight on historical injustices. It's been almost 3 years since people everywhere watched in horror as images of blatant racism were broadcast to their computers, TVs, phones, and tablets. From your perspective, do you think much has changed? Is the momentum still moving forward?
Bruce, yes and no. Yes, in the extent that, the significant events that unfolded with the focus on the atrocities committed in the last 2 years against folks that come from minority communities and racialized Black communities, epitomized, if you want, or accentuated by the George Floyd murder, definitely have mobilized in ways that are unprecedented a lot of stakeholders in society, governments and philanthropic leaders, nonprofit leaders, private sector leaders, and others. And because of that, definitely there has been almost like a new realization that we cannot continue as a society having these types of ongoing inequities among ourselves. So there has been all sorts of reactions to that, some by governments, some by philanthropic foundations, by other actors in community. So because of that, we have seen an increase in participation in terms of supporting Black and racialized communities. We have seen that manifesting itself in terms of new investments and programs. There have been new relationships forged. There have been deeper conversations of courage and care and empathy happening. But also, in a sense, because the socioeconomic indicators that have been there for the longest of times, that have put Black and other racialized communities on the periphery of this country, so to speak, are still there. So when everything's said and done, for Black communities and racialized communities and others, we're still dealing with those systemic challenges. That's why I think for me, part of this conversation is yes, we're tracking in terms of the change, but this change is not going to happen overnight. So what's kind of the call of leadership for all of us when you think medium to long term. So it's both a yes and no for me, Bruce.
And I think that's a great way of framing it. And I think it's very consistent with what we're going to see in the findings from the equity benchmarking study, which is signs of progress, but still lots of work to do. So we're going to turn our attention to some of the findings from the study itself. As we think about how charities and nonprofits can advance their own work in equity and inclusion, the findings are pretty clear about the impact of committees and or other equity working groups. We heard a few things. About a third of organizations have some sort of equity working group. Larger organizations are more likely to have these groups, but less likely to be BIPOC-led. The likelihood of having an equity working group is much higher amongst BIPOC-led organizations and organizations led by leaders from other underrepresented groups, but only when they're small. So it seems that larger, white-led organizations have the resources to create working groups, and smaller BIPOC-led organizations are more likely to be convening these groups. So first, from your perspective, is this a surprising finding? And second, from your experience, how important is it to establish these kinds of support and working groups within organizations?
First of all, I wanted to really commend the Equitable Recovery Collective, its members, and the work that Imagine Canada and its partners have been doing so far to really ground this focus on equity in our charitable and nonprofit sector in Canada. This study is groundbreaking and, of course, confirms some of the long-held beliefs that we have, but also it invites us to imagine a different way moving forward as sector leaders. I think I am not that surprised by the results, partly because someone like me has been in the trenches for a long time, leading this work, facilitating, supporting organizational change in all sorts of organizations, including funding organizations. And I think what it tells you is equity and change doesn't happen by chance. It needs to be enabled. And to enable it, you need to have organizational structures. And that's why those big organizations, white-led organizations that have resources, they can actually enable some of this work if they respond to the call of leadership. Yeah. And I think the BIPOC and racialized Black community organizations that are doing this work, for them, it's almost like it's a way of living because they are impacted by the forms of inequity, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, whatever forms of exclusion that they are experiencing. It's a lived experience. It's almost like they don't have so much options, so to speak, like they have to constantly be there as advocates and leaders for social justice. I think the discussion is different now because the data is telling us in the context of an organization, we have a realization here that those that intentionally have a structure such as an equity working group or another form of enabling structure within their systems have a better chance actually of leading the change. Yeah. When I have seen real change helping organizations are those organizations that create a locks of control and change for this work internally. It doesn't happen through the goodwill of people. You have to enable it, you have to facilitate it, and you have to be realistic in terms of what it takes, both in terms of resources and time, to effect the change that all of us want to see.
And I think your framing around intentionality and this way of working and way of living is absolutely spot on from what we saw from the findings. So we're going to talk a little bit about this sort of starting point. As organizations think about starting their diversity, equity, and inclusion journeys, a logical starting point is to reflect on the current state. And the study asked whether their organizations had ever conducted equity audits of specific aspects of their activities. And these were defined as some form of systemic or systematic review using an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens. And some of the key findings included 3 in 5 organizations have audited at least one aspect of their operations using a DEI lens. And both organizations that are led by leaders from other underrepresented groups and organizations with equity working groups are more likely to have audited virtually all aspects of their organizations and operations. And the variances were huge. For example, organizations with an equity working group were almost 25% more likely to have audited their board composition and performance. So let's talk about this. In your mind, how important is this starting point of conducting equity audits for organizations as they think about their journey?
Bruce, it's very important. I would start actually by, and this is the work that many have done in terms of really promoting and fostering equity change in organizations. It's really like for leaders in organizations, both operational and governance leaders, to really ask the question, why is this important? And so in the context of the study, you will see that actually principles matter. So I think one of the things that I've always encouraged organizations as leaders, like identify the underpinning principles that actually guide this type of work in terms of like, if you really come to the same page, so to speak, around these principles, then you're going to actually quickly realize that you need to have a good reading of the state of being. It's just like you have to take the pulse of the organization where things are at. And that's why an equity review is very important in terms of a starting point. But unless you have some guiding principles that put you in the same container, so to speak, there is a risk that here you might end up in a scattergram. Yeah. So what you wanted to do here is actually start by looking at the organizations and saying like, where's the locus of the change that we want to see here? Equity change, Bruce, is systemic change. It's not reducible to a project. It's not a list of things to do. It's not a protocol to have. It's not training in an organization. Those are important, but it's an organizational change process. And the ownership of the change from top to the board and senior management and management of our organization all the way to the frontliners, they have to have a vested interest in the outcome for change. And how can they do that if they don't have a sense of where they are? So equity audits are clearly important. They cannot happen if you don't enable them and have a structure within an entity, an organization that provides guidance and leadership. And I think where I have seen this happening work really well, it's actually an inter-level structure that brings management and board and staff at different levels in our organization working together to really create that sense of ownership and leadership for moving forward. So the data is very clear. 25% more are actually doing it. Why? Because they recognize the value of an audit. B, they enable it.
And it's interesting as you talk about this issue of ownership, of where the influence for this comes both internally and externally. And I know that the Equitable Recovery Collective was curious as to, were there any external drivers that were encouraging or propelling organizations forward and making changes? And one finding that we found interesting was related to the influence that funders are having as a driver of change related to DEI work. Compared to the other groups, a higher proportion of white-led organizations gave neutral responses, which may indicate some uncertainty. But what was also interesting to see is that opinions on this differ whether the organization was BIPOC-led, led by leaders from other underrepresented groups, or white-led. So for example, 18% of white-led organizations disagreed that funders have higher expectations of our organizations on DEI issues than they did prior to the pandemic, compared to 14% of BIPOC-led organizations. And on the same question, working groups again also mattered. 19% of those with no working group disagreed with rising funder expectations compared to 14% with working groups. So what do you think these findings say about the relationship between internal organizational leadership with expectations from outside groups like funders?
The data is clear again, Bruce. I think I would add an important player or stakeholder in terms of an influencer. Yes, definitely funders, but also the sector leaders themselves, those that are actually leading by example and doing really good work. They are also an important positive influence to the type of change that organization can aspire to. Yeah. And so here, I think those that are led by racialized community leaders and BIPOC are faring better in terms of recognizing the value of external influence. Let's not kid ourselves. Governments and funders and philanthropic leaders have a sway and an influence on the change that happens in the sector. From my own professional experience, Bruce, funders themselves, they wanted to be learners in partnership with the sector about how change happens in DEI. They themselves are not necessarily have the magic wand to deliver equity outcomes for the sector. They are in themselves in need of working together with sector leaders to really ground DEI for themselves and for the sector. That has been my experience. We are partners in solution with governments and philanthropy and funders in this area. Yeah? Yes, I think there is here an influence that funders can yield. And not surprisingly, again, those organizations that have an enabling structure in the form of an equity working group actually respond favorably to the question that funders can influence change. When probably in the course of this discussion, later on we might explore is like, what are some things that we can do as sector leaders to actually incentivize change? When I have done this work with sector leaders, I always speak about this is a systems change work. I've always encouraged leaders to move away from reducing these to things to do, to projectify this. This is real. It's the change of the mind, the heart, and the hands. The tools are important. The policies are important. But like any organizational change process, there is a dimension of time that you have to figure out here. But also you need to figure out, okay, from an appreciative inquiry perspective, what I like about this study, there are a lot of positive things that this study is surfacing. Yeah? How do we build on that? And I think part of that is like, how do we bring funders and philanthropy into the picture in a way that could actually facilitate and incentivize change in our organizations?
Yeah, it's interesting. Your comments made me think about the study that was released earlier this year on JADE in corporate social responsibility and how companies themselves are thinking they themselves need to go through a transformation before they're ready to work more effectively with organizations. And that was certainly highlighted in that study. And I think one of the themes that continues to come through the data is around leadership and intentionality. And so, while it might not be a surprising finding, staff buy-in was viewed as a strong enabler. For organizations with equity working groups, 72% of respondents agreed that it was a slight, moderate, or strong enabler. And the findings remain strong with 59% saying the same thing for organizations without working groups. And I know you just sort of touched on it a little bit in terms of some of these other considerations, but in your mind, what needs to change for those organizations that are struggling with staff buy-in? What are the kinds of things they should be doing to change the mindset about the importance of this work?
One of the things that needs to happen from my perspective, Bruce, is that we need to have a frank conversation with care and empathy with sector leaders, organizational leaders, about how this work is actually integral to the Monday to Friday stuff that happens in organizations. This is not an add-on. This is not something that needs to be done. It's almost like, how do you reframe your program design and development when you put a DEI lens? Yeah. How do you do your governance differently when you put a DEI lens? Yeah. How do you lead as a leader, as a manager, differently when you don that hat that integrates diversity and inclusion into your work? So one of the things that I have done and others have done, for example, is actually started this, guided by principles, started this almost at the theory of change level in an organization. And if you put a theory of change level about the programs and service, governance, management, everything that's happening in an organization, and bring data to the fore, so to speak, that shows you're actually better off in terms of the quality of your programs. You're better off in terms of quality of the outcomes that you lead as an organization. You have better generative conversations at the board table if you integrate diversity and inclusion and harvest the diverse perspective of your board members. Then people will start seeing this as integrated rather than as work to do. Sometimes, we get into this impasse where people consider this as another box to tick because it's required, because funders are telling us, or because, it's corporate social responsibility. Step back from that and say, let's look at our organization and figuring out, okay, how better off we will be because our programs and services, our governance, our management, our partnership, our relationships are actually now richer because we have put a DEI lens to this. So part of this is actually help them see the light, so to speak, in terms of the other, as I mentioned earlier on, is incentivizing, because it's not easy work. I've always encouraged the leaders to have the courage to have difficult but necessary conversations about this with care and empathy. And we are not here trying to put any leader backs against the wall. No, We're all partners in solutions. We're working together. We're driven by the data that's telling us there is inequity that we have to deal with collectively. And we have the toolbox to do that. We have the commitment that we can bring. We have the resources that we can bring to the table. Let's figure out how we move forward. And that's why, for me, when I have done this work helping organizations, starting with a theory of change about this work makes a difference.
So we're going to pick up on this theme that you just talked about, but maybe narrow the focus a little bit to a particular subset that we saw within the results. So when we look at the overall results, it seems like one could say that the results of this study are a wake-up call for white leaders, particularly those in mid-sized and smaller organizations. White leaders are more likely to be investing in some form of equity working group when they work for larger organizations. White leaders in mid-sized and smaller organizations, where their missions aren't directly related to equity issues, are far less likely to be creating equity working groups, which we've seen is a key driver of moving this ahead. This language is pretty direct, with most charities and nonprofits falling into the category of small and mid-sized and are white-led. What do you think will need to happen to create a tipping point for greater engagement in DEI issues? Like, where is that incentivizing taking place, and how can we encourage those leaders to be moving forward?
Great question, Bruce. And this is, I think, the essence of this conversation, because the majority of our organizations are in that category. It's a combination of things for me. It's incentivizing, it's support, but also it's ensuring that this is where funders and the sector together comes. Like, this is where standards, matter. This is where compliance would be important in terms of, there are all sorts of subsectors that do certification, for example. There is the standards that Imagine Canada, for example, has successfully implemented over the years. There are all sorts of, United Ways and philanthropic foundations and governments that actually interact at the data level. One of the things that you'll see in the study, for example, those organizations that have working groups, they actually are doing far better in terms of metrics and evaluation around this work. So at the end of the day, the results and the change is manifested in the data and metrics that tell us we're making progress. And so part of this is like funders and governments and sector leaders coming together. It's like, how can we actually build the capacity of these organizations to do the right evaluation and metrics around this work? Yeah. This work cannot happen if there is no commitment from leaders, both operationally and at the governance table. But more importantly, the same leaders that we're talking about, they need support to actually do this in the right way. For me, I think part of this is there has to be a sector-wide initiative and support that actually really understands where we can make the difference. There are some who are entrants in this work. There are some that are really doing well. There are some in between. I think as a sector collectively, we can come and think about, in collaboration with governments and funders, how do we create a support system for this type of organizations that are employing the most in our sector? The other is like, is there an opportunity here to talk to those certification bodies, those that are running standards, to actually integrate requirements around DEI that will allow organizations to actually go through that process of change that needs to happen. So for me, it's a combination of things. And when I have done this work, I think, like what? In systems change, Bruce, change cannot happen if we don't shift the mindset of leaders. Yeah. We start there. And I think part of shifting the mindset is saying, like, here's why this work is important. This is the changes that you want to see and you will be able to see. But here are some of the minimum requirements of doing this work. And so if we do that from an appreciative inquiry perspective, like in this study, we have 3 out of 5 that actually have some sort of equity working group. Yeah. What are they doing good or well that we can transfer in terms of lessons to those that need that? Yeah. So for me, it's a sector effort. And also it's realization that medium to long term, we need to stay the course around this. It's not a project to start and end. Yeah. This is an ongoing organizational process. It's dealing with the culture of organizations and being intentional.
Yeah, and it's such a great point about this being sort of longer term system level change. I know even for the Imagine Canada Standards program, hearing from sector leaders about the need to include a standard related to DEI policies is something that is now part of the program. And we hope that for those 300 organizations or almost 300 organizations that are in the program now and those contemplating it, this will be a start of a process that some of them may have already been underway, but others not so much. This could be a catalyst for some kind of change in the future. The study's pretty rich with data, and we've sort of been picking and choosing different areas. I want to zero in on another aspect of the data that we found. One of the compelling findings in the report speaks to funding and finances as being greater barriers for BIPOC-led organizations as they seek to apply equity, diversity, and inclusion principles in their work. We were really struck by the fact that 74% of BIPOC-led organizations saw financial resources as a barrier compared to 52% of white-led organizations. That's a 22-point difference, and that's huge. Do you think things are getting any better for BIPOC-led organizations on the funding front? Like, from your perspective, do you think that funder commitments made in 2020 have translated into real support?
No, that's the stark reality, unfortunately. I think there have been some progress. Part of the discussion that NABC is having with a number of funders that have been funding BIPOC and racialized communities is how do we sustain some of the gains that we had over the last 2 years? Because frankly speaking, the donations and the funding is dwindling. The commitment is fading. And you have seen also this in your own corporate social responsibility focused study. So I think part of this is pre-pandemic and then post-pandemic really accentuated and amplified more. Many of these BIPOC organizations were actually living and dying in precarity. And it's not surprising when there is such a disruption. The first to be affected and go are small, racialized, community-based organizations. We have seen that cyclically, for example, during recession and significant government defunding that happened over the years. So with the current situation is like, BIPOC organizations, most of them, they are in a precarious situation. That's why the advocacy, collectively we had with Imagine Canada and others around the concept of core funding is critically important. Whether it's core funding or general operating support, we need to be able to really fund properly those organizations that are, so to speak, on the margins of the sector and the country itself, so that we don't have this type of challenge. But my concern at the moment is that as we venture more into the future and away from the commitment and drive that we have seen with the times that we had the incident with George Floyd and the pandemic, things are dwindling. And the resources might not be there, so to speak, because priorities and interests are shifting. The key thing for our discussion here and why it's important to pay attention to DEI as sector leaders, whether it's the nonprofit or charitable sector, is there is significant inequity in Canada. And we are at the forefront, all of us in the sector, in fighting inequity. And the fight has just started and gotten even more accentuated because of the pandemic impact. And I don't have to speak about this, but the pandemic clearly has disproportionately impacted and even increased the inequity of racialized communities. So in the end, I think the collective advocacy for core funding is critically important. I don't think we are better off than we were 2 years ago.
Well, and it's an interesting point, and this was called a benchmarking study for a reason. I mean, we want to be going into the field in the future and seeing if anything is changing. And so whether it is changes to the disbursement quota, qualifying disbursements and direction and control rules, continued efforts at core funding, it'll be interesting to see if that significant gap changes the next time we do this study. I guess the hope is that it will. So, Amanuel, I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking a lot about different parts of this particular report and study, but as we wind up our episode, your role with NABC provides you with a unique vantage point, talking with other sector leaders, government officials, elected officials, academics, etc. And as we look ahead to the future, what do the findings from this report bring to mind? Any thoughts or insights just to leave our listeners with about the future?
Bruce, first of all, as I said in the beginning, I really commend the Equitable Recovery Collective for its leadership around this. I think what this benchmarking does for all of us, especially for our peers, white leaders that are running big and medium-sized organizations, like as a wake-up call here. So there's some good story here that we can build on, and there's some work that needs to be done. Yeah? And that work is a collective work for all of us. It's not, leaving people to really deliver change on their own. It's a collective sectoral change process as far as I'm concerned. The key thing for me here is that I have used the appreciative inquiry here. We have to be intentional of using asset-based approaches to amplify what's working. And so if we will really put a bit of a spotlight on those organizations and leaders that are really doing the right thing, we continue supporting them to continue doing that, but also bring some of the lessons learned to others in the sector. That's one thing. The other thing is we need to move away from this concept that the sector is doing this work and funders and governments are there. We're all partners in solution. As a former funder myself, I know that we struggle with the same questions. And so bringing both sides of the equation would be important here for both governments, funders, and the sector itself. The other thing is from a funding perspective, I think we have a critical momentum at the moment in terms of really bringing sector leaders to continue advocating for those core resources that are needed. DEI is not going to happen just because we want it. It needs to be enabled and resourced. Yeah? And so we need to continue with the collective advocacy around core funding for the sector. The last comment that I have is when you talk about sustainability of the gains, sustainability is not reduced to dollars and cents only. Funds are important, but it's also a function of leadership. That's why earlier on your point around leadership important. We need to invest in our leaders, in their capacity to collaborate and work together, in knowledge mobilization and exchange of lessons learned among our leaders. Yeah? So that concept of system leadership that we need for DEI, we need to nurture that. We have to put a spotlight and work with governments and funders and sector leaders. What's the system leadership that we need in Canada for really pushing forward DEI?
Amanuel, it's always a pleasure to connect. And thank you so much for taking the time to explore some of these findings from the equity benchmarking study with us today on the podcast. And we hope that those who are listening will spread the word and invite others to both dive into the data and then participate in an ongoing conversation about how we're going to make real, true, intentional systemic change. So thank you so much, Amanuel.
Bruce, I really enjoyed this conversation and look forward to this ongoing collective work. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Let's Imagine podcast. For full show notes and to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an episode, please visit our website, www.imaginecanada.ca. Also, if you really like this episode, we invite you to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast, as this helps other people discover us and engage in these conversations. And again, thanks to our sponsors, Carter's Professional Corporation and Sage Canada, for supporting our podcast.